Welcome back to A Fine Time for Healing, a place where your physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being are all that matter. So put your feet up, relax, and enjoy today's show. Whew, it's going to be a really, really interesting one. This is a show, um, the subject matter, I have never done anything like this before, and I'm really, really excited to bring this to you because I think it's going to have a huge impact on you. Today we have with us Lee Ellis, who is founder and president of Leadership Freedom LLC and Freedom Star Media. He is an award-winning author, leadership coach, and expert presenter in the area of leadership, team building, and human performance. His past clients include Fortune 500 senior executives and C-level leaders in telecommunications, healthcare, military, and other business sectors. His last book is entitled Engage with Honor, Building a Culture of Courageous Accountability, and his latest book is entitled Captured by Love, Inspiring True Romance for Vietnam POWs. That's right, Vietnam POWs. That's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome, Lee. It's so great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you today, Randi.
So your book is about the positive outcome of experiencing prisoner of war conditions in Vietnam. And you feature in your book the love stories that came out of it. And now these are couples who are in their later years, 80s, and still together and very much in love. But you were a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and it makes me shudder, and I'm sure it makes everybody else shudder, to even begin to imagine what that was like. So can you share with us how you ended up as a prisoner of war and what your experience was like?
Yes, I will. I'd be happy to. I just realized I didn't turn my light on. Let me turn my light on.
Sure, go.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, and you're all lit up. Look at you. Okay.
I've lightened up.
Okay.
So here we go. I grew up on a farm in North Georgia plowing mules, but I looked up every day and saw those airplanes going over, and I wanted to fly. I'd always wanted to fly. And so when I got into University of Georgia, I got in Air Force ROTC. It was required back then. And sure enough, I passed all the tests, the physical test I was concerned about, the mental test too. And I became a second lieutenant in the Air Force when I graduated from college in 1965. 3 days later, I was in Valdosta going to flight school. And 53 weeks later, I got my wings and an assignment that said F-4 Phantom, Pipeline, Southeast Asia. That meant I was going to, this was 1966, August 1966. The war in Southeast Asia was building up, and the air war especially. And so as quick as I could get combat trained, I was going to be flying in combat. And sure enough, that happened. And by the summer of 67, I went to Da Nang Air Base. I flew in South Vietnam, close air support for the Army and the Marines, interdiction missions in Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail over there. But most of my missions were over in North Vietnam, and I had 53, and on my 53rd one, my airplane was hit and blew up, and I had to eject. The airplane was tumbling, blown into pieces, and I was coming down that parachute, executing all the training I'd had, but I was surrounded by the militia and captured within 2 minutes. It took 2 weeks to get to Hanoi, and there I was put in the Hanoi Hilton, which was actually a jail built by the French downtown. It was Maison Centrale, was what the French called it. They built in the 1890s. It was a Bastille prison, and walls were 14 feet high, 4 or 5 feet thick. No one ever escaped there, and that's where I went. And most all POWs went through there initially because that was kind of the end processing place. And then they had 2 or 3 other camps we might go to. But I stayed there for 8 months and then went to another camp and then came back. And all in all, I was there 5.5 years.
Oh my goodness.
Mm.
Um, we imagine or can't even imagine what it would be like to be in that, not only locked up in that facility, not where your loved ones don't even know where you are and that kind of thing, but also the experience of the torture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was that like and how did you endure it?
Well, we were committed. Almost everybody there was committed to follow the code of conduct. There's 6 articles. Basically, it says you'll be faithful to your country. You won't collaborate with the enemy. You won't share any information with them. And you'll be faithful to your fellow POWs. And you're going to resist until you can get out of there. So that was 6 articles we'd memorized in our training. And so we were committed to that. And we're soldiers and we're going to do our best to live up to that. And so when they wanted something from us, either propaganda, they wanted us to make anti-war propaganda for them, or they wanted us to share something about information, military information, of which we really didn't, most of us knew nothing that was really valuable or even top secret or secret or something like that, because we never knew what the next day's target was going to be, so that we really didn't know those kind of things. But they were going to torture us, and they believed that we knew all of that and that we should help them. And eventually, they could make you do something, and they wouldn't let you die. Because when you're being tortured, we found out that 99% of the people are eventually going to give in and not die. And they didn't want us to die because they wanted to have us as a hostage in case they needed, Americans there. They had a few of us there and they were glad to have us. So it was a battle. I can remember the first time I was tortured, they wanted me to fill out a 3-page biography. Now, the biography had all sorts of family and military station, where I'd been assigned and all that, financial information. I think they were building that for the Russians. I think they were building, background information on American pilots for the Russians. But I wouldn't fill it out. My cellmates wouldn't fill it out, and so they started torturing us. And after a few hours of us, now I had what we called the humane torture at that time, and you're on your knees in leg irons and handcuffs with your hands on a wall. And after a few hours, your knees and your whole body starts quivering and shaking, and you fall down. And the guards come in and grab you and put you back up and hit you a time or two. And then you go back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. And finally, I felt I just can't do this. I can't stay up anymore, and they're going to kick and hit my head and everything. So I think I got to go to another strategy here. And so I said, okay, I'll fill it out. Well, I did in that interrogation room, but the only thing I put down that was true was my father's first and last name. Everything else was a lie. And but after I'd done that, they left me in there in handcuffs and leg irons for a few more hours. And I cried like a baby. I cried because I was so ashamed. I was the lowest human being that ever worn a uniform because I could not beat them. I'd given in. Even though I didn't give them anything, the fact that I had given in and written stuff, I felt worthless. But then I get back to my cell, and there's one guy already back there. He didn't last as long as I did. He did the same thing I did. And a few hours later, the other guy comes back, and he was a tough guy, incredibly tough. And he had given in also. And then we learned a few months later that everybody had been through that, and everybody, some lasted longer than others, but eventually everybody gave in and gave something. And what we learned was you had to bounce back. You had to believe in yourself. You had to bounce back, do your best. And our leaders gave us, eventually we caught up with what they had said. They said, resist up to the point of permanent physical or mental damage, and then give no more. Go ahead and give as little as possible. Bounce back, get ready because they're coming after you again. Stay united through communications. Pray every day. Go home proud. Return with honor. Very simple, but that built a culture of courageous accountability.
Wow. Your strategy, I think, was, very smart. And really, what did they expect you to do? Be honest? How would they know the difference?
They didn't know a lot about our culture. So we could, one guy was tortured, telling the names of some people who had refused to fly. Nobody in his squadron, Navy guy, had ever refused to fly. And finally, he gave in and said it was who was Superman's real name?
Clark Kent?
Yeah, Clark Kent. And then the other guy was a famous guy on TV. He gave him those two names. Well, of course, everybody in America knew that guy was lying. It was really brilliant way to handle it, but they had tortured him really hard. They had him in the pretzel, which was tying your ankles and your hands behind your back, and then they would tie a rope around your elbows and cinch them up until they touched, which means you were being torn up in here. And then they would grab your arms and lift them up over your head, which tore it more. So it was incredible torture. But he finally gave in, and it was Ben Casey. I think it was Ben Casey and Clark Kent.
Dr. Casey. Oh my gosh, that's funny. But when you're in these situations, it's amazing. You do what you have to do to survive. I know there was a situation I was in my early years, my early adulthood, where there was no way for me to get out of this really alive, and I used some crazy psychology, and I managed to do it. And and there's no way to think about this kind of thing beforehand. You just your survival just steps in and just gives you these tools. Do you have any?
That's why it's so important to bounce back, because we're all going to take hits in life.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Do you have any physical damage, physical issues in your body from what you've experienced?
No, I didn't. Some of the guys, a lot of the guys who went through the pretzel, their hands, because it cut off the circulation, it took them a long time to get their feeling back into their hands. And some of them still have scars where those ropes were tied there and it tore off the skin, have some that. But most everybody physically recovered. We learned that the human body and the human mind are much more resilient than we really think they are. We lived off of a bowl of soup in the morning and a bowl of soup in the afternoon with either a cup of rice and a little baguette of bread for years. And then finally they started feeding us a little bit more. And we lost weight and all, but we stayed alive and not much protein. But we had no medical care. As far as, we got sick occasionally and have the flu, but we were very resilient. And now we're outliving our peers.
Amazing. You said in your book somewhere that you resorted to eating like bugs and worms and things like that for protein.
There was in August, there were so many little bugs in the soup and in the bread. But especially in the bread, they had been like little bugs, weevils. The first August I was there, August of '68, and we were getting this loaf of French bread type thing. And I pulled out 1 cubic inch of bread and I said, I'm going to take a survey so I can have evidence when I go home. And I counted, there were 44 weevils in 1 cubic inch of bread. And fortunately, they'd been baked, so there was probably some good protein in there.
They were baked in. Wow.
Yeah.
Because they were in the flour, I guess.
Wow. They hatched out in August and they got in the flour. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. How many other soldiers, Air Force men, were captive at the time that you were?
There were about 300, and between 350 and 400 of us were there more than 5 years. The bombing stopped, and most all of us were air crews, okay, up in Hanoi. There was a few Army guys that were captured in 1968 during the Tet Offensive in that era, and there were probably 30 or 40 of those up there. And actually, there were three Catholic missionaries there that were brought up there, and one was only two of them, well, five of them, but only two survived. But they were in another camp, so they weren't part of our camp. So the Hanoi Hilton complex there was all air crew, and there were between around 350 that were there more than 5 years, up to 8 years. 2 or 3 of them were 8 years, and then I was 5.5. But the bombing quit in August of 1968. And so for 3 years, over 3 years, we didn't get any new POWs. And then the bombing started in 1972 to end the war. Mm-hmm. And that's when we got another 100 in, because they did a big bombing campaign in December of 72, where they were a lot captured. But it ended the war and brought us home. So generally, though, figure 350 or so. We had one time after a raid on one of the camps, we'd all moved out, but they raided it, the special forces did, but we'd moved out. And they got scared and moved us all back into the Hanoi Hilton, into large cells where Vietnamese prisoners had been. And that's when we went into the big cells of 40 to 60 guys in a cell. And we were there for a couple of years. And that's when we really started to heal. Locked up with these guys, and we got along really well. It was amazing how well we got along. I think we just knew that we were all together, and we had to be brothers, and we had to accept each other. And that's where we really emotionally got healed,
That's amazing. Why? So there had to have been other POWs. So the Hanoi Hilton was just for the airmen. Where did they keep other POWs?
Well, of that 350, in the early years, we were in about 4 or 5 different camps. They had about 50 to 60 guys in each camp. Okay. But after that raid, they brought us all back there. But there was only another 50 or so prisoners in North Vietnam alive up there. Most of them, so more than probably half to 2/3 of them died from either injuries. They were in the jungles, moving along slowly with the army coming back, or they got some kind of typhoid fever or something and died living in the jungles. Hmm. Yeah.
And I had asked you this before we went on air. So I was reading your book, Captured by Love, and I was looking, because of the work that I do, I was looking for the remnants of, or the indications of, post-traumatic stress disorder, because we know that, of course, this is shell shock, or whatever they used to call it, is now PTSD. And I noticed that there was no indication of that, and I had asked you that. So explain to the listeners why you all came home with no post-traumatic stress disorder.
Let me give you one piece of background information most people don't know. The wives of the POWs and MIAs, missing in action, prisoners of war, began to get organized. They'd been told to keep quiet by the government. And after 2 or 3 years, they decided that was not working, because our communist captors were not treating us in accordance with the Geneva Conventions on treatment of captives, and which should have been lenient, humane treatment, and being able to write letters, and they would identify all the people who were alive POWs. Well, they didn't do any of that. And so the wives started putting pressure. And when the Nixon administration came in 1969, Secretary Laird joined them and changed the policy to go public. And they got a lot of sponsorship by Ross Perot and help there. They went to Paris and confronted the Paris delegation of the Paris peace talks, the communists there. They sent millions of letters from people in the U.S. there. They put pressure on them. So when Ho Chi Minh died in the fall of '69, who was the president and founder of the communist North Vietnam, the new leaders stopped the torture. And for the most part, there was very little torture going on in the camps for those years after, let's say, 1970, 71, 72, and then we came home in 73. So we had time to get healthy because our treatment went day to day, living day to day. And then after that raid, we got into a big cell with a whole bunch of guys locked up. And we just realized that we had to get along. And I had to accept you, and you accepted me. And we're different, but we're the same on a lot of things, and we're different on some things. And it was a good group of people because, you know, most of us were air crew. We'd been selected to be certain level of intelligence and ability and trained, well trained. And so what happened was we realized that if we came home with bitterness, anger about the war, about our captors, about the communists, well, communism, we still held a little anger toward, but not the people, because the people lived under it. They had to. And so every day we worked to turn loose of some of that anger and bitterness and shame about being there and all that. And we got healthier. We wanted to go home healthy because we knew that everybody's going to think that we were just crazy as bats if we've been locked up for 5, 6, 7,
Right.
8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to go home. We're going to fool you. We're going to go home healthy.
Right.
And so being authentic, being vulnerable, being locked up with people like that for days at a time, years at a time, helped us to grow healthy. And we came home with very little PTSD, much lower than the combat veterans who fought in the South.
Truly amazing. I was a child. I think I was in probably middle school at the time that the Vietnam War ended. I had an older sister who was a protester. She was a hippie. You know, she went through all of that. I remember this. I remember the time very vividly, and I know that my peers, the draft ended just before my peers got to be 18 years old, and it was like, whoa, you know, they really dodged a bullet there. But I know my father, who was a World War II vet, and very patriotic, he was very much against this war. You know, I remember him saying that he would have taken his sons and gone to another country and gotten them away from it because it was such a horrible war and we shouldn't have been in it. But so let's move on to the better part of this. So you wrote this book, Inspiring True Romance Stories from Vietnam POWs. And what inspired you to write that?
You know, of course, we knew each other very well, having lived together. A lot of us, I didn't live with everybody, but I lived with, probably 60 or 70 guys over the years up there, and got to know them really well. And I knew all about their family and so on. And we came home. Now, I was single, but we came home. And over the years after we came home, well, I got married. Met my wife within a year or so. And I kept hearing the stories. I met the wives and got to know them at reunions and sort of thing. And we really became close. And so I thought, Hollywood couldn't write a script this crazy. Some of these stories of these women who were waiting on their husbands 6, 7, 8 years, and now they've been married, over 50, over 60 years. And that's a great story. And then some of the single guys like me, how we met some people. And it was just unreal, and so I said, somebody's going to write the story. Well, I was writing on another book back a few years ago, and I said, I can't do it now. And then finally I said, well, Lee, you're the youngest guy, about the younger. There's 2 guys that are a few months younger who was more than 5 years, POW, more than 5 years. And so you've written books, so you probably better get on with this because nobody's going to write it if you don't. So I hired a romance writer to help me to make it more romantic because I knew I couldn't. And we worked with 20 couples to get their stories. Now, about half of them were married and stayed married 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And about a fourth of them, 5 of those 20, were married and they came home and their wives said, I'm out of here. We're divorced. I don't want to see you again. Just move on. And 5 of us were single in this book, the 20 stories. And we met someone, most of them met someone within 90 days and were married within 6 or 8 months. I dated all these wonderful, beautiful girls, but they just weren't the one until I met Mary. And I was probably the last bachelor to get married. It was a little over a year,
Hmm.
or a year and 2 months before I met her, and then 6 or 8 months before we married. And so I've only been married 48 years and 10 months.
Okay, is that all?
A
Is
lot
that
of the
all?
guys have been married more than 49 years now because we've been home 50 years.
Oh wow. Yeah, one of the stories you talk about, he met the woman, she was a greeter when he got off the plane. Um,
Yeah.
and it had sort of been already in the works that he was going to be fixed up with her. But tell us that story.
Well, I think that's one with Tom. Tom McNish, he was single, and all these years he had been dreaming about this wonderful wife he was going to have, and she was going to be, you know, 5'6" or 7" and brunette, uh, slim and Christian. He was strong Christian. Well, he comes home and he gets off the airplane and gives a 1 minute speech there in Montgomery, Alabama at Maxwell Air Force Base. And there's this widow up there on the roof, look at base operations, looking down because her best friend's husband is on that same group. He's coming home, and she's been wearing his bracelet and selling bracelets to people, and she's been part of the movement of families, to help the POW wives and all. And she sees this guy, and he gives his little speech, and she knows he's single because her friend had told her about him. And he gives something about, he gives a little speech, and he says, and I'm looking forward to meeting the girl, or something like that, a beautiful girl or something. And she yells out, "Yippee!" They didn't know each other. And 2 weeks later, her friend, whose husband had come home, said, "Hey, you need to meet Tom." And she set him up for a date. And about 5 weeks later in the White House, when they invited us all, he was dating her, and he invited her to go to the White House with him. Now she's Jewish and has 2 children, and she's a blonde. She's not real outgoing like the girl he was dreaming about, totally opposite.
Mhm.
And he proposed to her in the East Room at the White House.
Oh, that's
Been
great.
married, they've been married 49 years, and I've never seen a better marriage than Tom and Yona. They've just had a wonderful time.
Your book, let's see. You have forewords by Tony Orlando and Gary Sinise. And Tony Orlando is the Tony Orlando that wrote "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree," and he recorded that.
Yeah, he didn't write it, but he
He
recorded it.
recorded it. Okay.
And it was #1 in the nation the month after we came home.
Oh, it was.
Yes, and in fact, it was one of the top songs in all the world.
I remember.
It was huge.
Mhm.
And so, Bob Hope was Ross Perot and some people in Dallas decided to put on a welcome home for all veterans in the Dallas area, and they invited all the POWs to come there the first week and the first Saturday in June. And we went down there, and they invited Bob Hope to be the master of ceremonies, and they had a lot of entertainers there. And we were in the Cotton Bowl with 30 or 40,000 people, and we were down on the field, and the stage is at one in the end zone there. And Tony Orlando comes out and sings "Tie Yellow Ribbon" and Dawn. And oh my gosh, there are 2 stories in this book that tie to that. Well, Tony Orlando has been invited to come to our reunions because of that. And he comes most every reunion and sings at our reunions. So we invited Tony Orlando to do the foreword. But Gary Sinise has also done so much for veterans, and he's a good friend of mine also. So I invited Gary to do that, and both of them did. So we have 2 of the most famous guys around. And Tony Orlando does a lot of work for veterans, lots of work for veterans too.
Yes.
Both, yeah, they love the book, and they know a lot of us. They've come to some of our reunions. Gary has. Tony Orlando comes to almost all of them. In fact, he sang this year at our 50th reunion at the Nixon Library.
Wow. Um, Gary Sinise, was he interested in this before he shot that film? What was it? Born on the 4th of July or something like that. Was that the movie he was in?
I think so. I know he was Lieutenant Dan in
Yeah,
Forrest.
Lieutenant Dan. Right. Okay. Okay. So was that the beginning of his interest in Vietnam?
I don't know. You know, he had his brother-in-law was a Vietnam veteran, and he was and one of his brothers, I think, also. And that's what really got him interested in veterans was some of the things his brother-in-law went through. I think it was his wife's brother. I read his great book, by the way, Gary Sinise's book. But it was people in his family that really brought him in to start with. And then the more he got into it, the more he started connecting with Vietnam veterans also.
It was Forrest Gump. That's what it was.
Yeah, he was
Yeah, it was Forrest Gump. Lieutenant Dan.
Yeah.
Right, from Forrest Gump. Right, I got that mixed up. Um, so yeah, so he got interested in that. So they wrote beautiful forewords for you in this book, and yeah, that's really interesting.
You know, we had some great endorsements from people who've written marriage and romance books also. Just famous people. It was just so glad that they thought the book was powerful for couples to read because of just the lessons in there, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you to give us a couple other examples of stories. But I wanted to say that it seemed like your experience was different than many of the other Vietnam vets that came home.
Yeah.
Why was that? Was that because you were POWs and
There's
you were
two
honored?
reasons, I think. I thought about this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Two reasons, I think. There may be others, but one reason is that we were welcomed home because of the National POW MIA League of Families and all the work that they did, the families and wives and families.
Mm-hmm.
They had raised so much awareness about our mistreatment that it became national. I mean, we had one very reserved lady who spoke to 25, 30,000 people at the Washington State football game in 1969 or 70. You know, another one, very shy lady, became president of the League of Families for the state of Virginia and got 750,000 letters written and took to Paris. So they created so much of an interest in our treatment that when we came home, we were welcomed. We got a lot of, Ford Motor Company gave us all a free car for a year.
Wow.
Can you believe that? I mean, that's Holiday Inn gave us a week at any Holiday Inn we wanted to stay at.
Wow.
I mean, just all sorts of stuff like that.
Mm.
And, you know, we had a lot of those yellow ribbons tied. When I was coming home from the airport with my parents, I was single. They were picked me up in Atlanta. They had already been to Montgomery and spent 3 days with me at the hospital over there. But now I'm actually going home to my hometown of Commerce, Georgia. And there was a parade there, but they're carrying me home. And I see all these yellow ribbons on these trees driving home on Interstate 85. And I said, "What's that about?" And she said, "Well, that's a song."
Oh.
A Yellow Rose. And, you know, if you welcome me home, you know. So we got that great welcome home. But most Vietnam veterans were mistreated, spit on, told not to wear their uniform because somebody might attack them. Because a lot of the hippies got overboard with the anti-war movement, and they saw a person wearing a uniform as being part of that decision to keep the war going. We were there fighting, but we didn't make those decisions. And these poor soldiers were mistreated and not welcomed home for the most part. So that was, and the fact that we had those 3 years locked up with other guys to get over our emotional, mental health, shame, guilt, terror, all those kind of things that we felt. We had time to get over that before we came home, whereas they didn't. They were fighting one day and coming home the next day.
And they were seeing horrible things.
Yes, yes. And see, here's the thing that's very, very important. You've got to be with a group that understands what your trauma is. It really helps if you can be with somebody who's been through what you've been through. It really helps, and they can talk. They understand. You understand. You can talk about it and get healthy together. That's why uh, group activity with people who've been through what you've been through is so important to getting healthy and getting over your trauma.
That's right. So you had the best possible outcome
We
considering
did.
what you went through.
Turned out being locked up like that after the torture stuff. If we'd have come home in summer of 1969, there was a lot of torture going on. In fact, there was an escape from one of the camps, and they were torturing all the camps. And several guys were being tortured to sign a statement, a one-page statement saying that they had received lenient and humane treatment.
Wow.
Tortured to sign that statement. And the guy says, "That's a lie. I'm not signing it." And the guy says, "No, it's truth. Truth is that which most benefits the party. The end justifies the means." Now, that's a scary thing, but that's what was happening. And so because they stopped the torture, though, it gave us time to get healthy and forgive, forget, and get over it.
What a spiritual blessing that was.
Oh, it was huge. It was huge. And by the way, there were a lot of spirituality was very important. A lot of guys tell the story of, hey, when I jumped out of my parachute, I was coming down my parachute, and I looked up and started praying. I said, "Lord, I hadn't talked to you in a while, but I need to now." Because once you're out of control and your enemy can kill you any day, all of a sudden you realize you need to pray. And guys would pray for hours. And people would ask me, I grew up going to church every Sunday and memorized Bible verses. And we didn't have a Bible. We didn't have any books. And my roommate would say, "Do you know any more Bible verses?" And I finally ran out, and I said, "No, I can't." But
some of the guys were in solitary confinement. The cells were like 18 inches wide, and how big? They were tiny.
yes, they were a little bit about just wide enough you could stand up. So probably a foot and a half wide, 3 feet, maybe 3 feet wide.
Wow.
But yeah, and not only that, but they would put them in leg irons sometimes all day long. Let them out in the morning and the afternoon.
And you said that they would do math problems in their head, and they would just keep doing things to keep their mind going.
Gosh, it's amazing what the mind can do when you're focused like that. We memorize poems, we memorize Bible verses, we memorize I learned to speak Spanish and French and 2,000 word vocabulary in German.
Wow.
Because we had time.
Right. Did all of your families know that you had been captured, or were there some of you who the families didn't know?
It depended on whether or not they let your name out right if you were captured. Some they did. Some of them were there 7.5 to 8 years. Their families knew right away. Some they didn't know for 3 years.
Wow.
In my case, it was 2 years. Now, they knew I was alive on the ground because I made a radio call on my emergency radio, handheld little thing here. And I did make a call and say, "Hey, I'm on the ground. I'm okay. I'm headed south to the river, start strafing at 300 meters north." And after the war, I saw my wingman, he said, "Well, we heard your call, but we decided we couldn't strafe because they were too close to you." I said, "Wise decision." They captured me in about 90 seconds.
Wow. So you had announced that you were there, and they were able to report that to your family. Wow. But for families that didn't know, that in itself is torture.
Hard. Oh, so hard. Yeah.
Right.
Really.
So tell us about another interesting love story from your book.
Well, we had one guy, a Navy pilot. He was there 5 years, a little over 5 years, and married and no children. But when he called his wife, we called home from the Philippines. We all went to the Clark Air Base, Philippines, which had the largest hospital in the Far East, American base.
Mhm.
And we went there, and we called home, talked to our families. Well, he called home, and his wife said, "I'm out of here. Goodbye." And he said, "I was really sad, but at the same time, I was free after 5 years in the POW camp, and I was free. So I had a lot to be happy about. And so I just kind of calmed myself down. God will provide for me." And he gets back. He's at the Dallas Cotton Bowl event. Tony Orlando is singing.
Mhm.
Tony Orlando and Don, they're singing. And he had been told, take a date. And so he invited somebody he knew. And there was this widow whose husband was a Marine helicopter pilot who didn't come home. She was an MIA wife, and she did a lot. She was chairman of the National League for a while.
Hmm.
She did a lot for our cause, and she had a little boy. She was pregnant when her husband went over to Vietnam or Laos, Vietnam, and she had a child, a little boy, while he was gone, and he didn't come home. So she didn't want to go to that, and she was invited to come to the Cotton Bowl, to this event and everything. And they had a party the night before, and this was Saturday afternoon, late Saturday afternoon, Saturday night. And her mother said, "You need to go. You go with Joe over here. Take him, and you go." And she did. And she's sitting there. Tony Orlando is singing, Don singing Yellow Ribbon, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. And he looks over, the Navy pilot looks over, and she's sitting next to him. He looks, and he's got a date, and she's got a date. He looks over, and she's got tears coming out of her eyes. He doesn't know her. And he leans over and puts his hand on her arm and gives her a kiss on the cheek. 6 months later, they were married.
Oh,
Isn't that something?
that's beautiful.
He was suffering the loss of his wife. She was suffering her husband not coming home. But they were able to have empathy together. And they really were to dating and just being empathetic to each other. And all of a sudden they realized they were happy together. And now they've been married 49 years, and they're a wonderful couple. He's 87, she's about 83 or 4. Amazing.
That is amazing. It was meant to be. It's just meant to be.
Yeah. And they tried to have children and couldn't. And so they adopted a couple of children, and she had her son, and they're all close family. Their kids live across the U.S., but they live in Hawaii, but they all come together and enjoy being together.
Great story.
Yeah. And then there was Mo Baker. Well, I should tell about somebody who was waiting, Smitty Harris. Now, Smitty was a POW almost 8 years. About 5 weeks short of 8 years. And he was the one that brought in the tap code so we could tap and communicate, tap on those walls and communicate.
Yes.
And his wife, Louise, they were stationed in Okinawa. And their best friend, they had lived next door to each other several times in the Air Force, and their best friend's wife had some health problems, but he got shot down. Let me back up. Let me back up. So I've got into another one. Smitty was living in Okinawa. His wife was 8 months pregnant. They had 2 little girls. And he went temporary duty over to Thailand, and he was shot down in 1965, March of 1965, captured. She's raising 2 little girls. She's 8 months pregnant. The military says, "Well, you need to go on back home." She said, "I'm not leaving till I have this baby." So she stood up and she stayed there and had the baby. Then she moved back, and they told her, said, "Well, you're not going to get your paycheck because your husband is missing in action, and you'll have to live on $300 a month or something." She said, "Nope." Called the Secretary of the Air Force. She did. She told him, "I got to have my husband's paycheck every month." And he said, "Well, I don't know if we can do that." And she said, "You better." He called her back before the end of the day and said, "You're right. You're going to get your paycheck." So she raised those 3 kids. He was there 8 years. He's the one that when he got out and called home that day, he didn't know what to say to her. He had been gone 8 years. Now they've been writing some letters every now and then. He got a 6-line letter. She got a 6-line letter 4 or 5 times a year. So he knew what had happened. She had a little boy, and he called her, and he didn't know what to say to her. And he just, off the top of his head, he said, "Hello, Jane. This is Tarzan." And, and she says, "I knew right then everything was going to be okay.
Oh,
We were going to be fine." And now they've been married 64 years. He's 94. And what a wonderful couple. Wonderful couple. You know,
wow.
they, the things that came out most strongly were these couples shared values,
Mhm.
had similar values. They, they had commitment. They were very, very committed to their mission in life, their purpose in life, and then to each other. And this commitment to each other helped them get through. The other thing that was very important, and I think we learned this in the POW camp, but they had some of this before. But one of the stories is entitled Independent and Interdependent. And that was so important. You've got to be independent. You cannot control the other person. They're not going to be like you. They are an individual, unique person. Okay. And you are a unique person. You got to be independent. But in a marriage, you need to be interdependent
Mm-hmm.
and serve each other and work with each other and respect each other and care for each other and trust each other. And in every story that comes out, but in this one story, this couple, his wife divorced him. She was a widow, pilot widow, and they married. And that's their stories about how each of them is independent but interdependent, and they respected each other. And they've been married 49 years with a great marriage. And she had 2 children. He had 2 children. They raised all 4 of them together and just have a wonderful family,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. So were there particularly different challenges with these couples than there would have been with couples that were not brought together through this experience? Were there unique challenges?
I, well, 5 of us were single and 5 of us were divorced, and there's 20 stories. So, yes, each one has some uniqueness, but I think the idea of being shared values and that commitment, once you make that commitment, you're not looking for any way out. You're looking to how to make it get through and to respect that person and treat them as they're really somebody. And when you do that, uh, it's healing for them. And it's healing. If they're doing that to you, it's healing for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because when somebody cares about you and shows you that you're worthy and important, that's healing. It helps you get over the trauma you experience. Nobody's perfect. We all have baggage from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my theory is, maybe it's somebody else's, but I came up with this about 20, 30 years ago, is that you marry to your own level of dysfunction. So a person who's 90% healthy typically marries somebody who's 90% healthy. If you're 90% healthy and you marry somebody who's 60%, they got a lot of baggage, it's going to be very difficult to have a good marriage. My wife's a licensed counselor, and most of the people that she doesn't do much marriage anymore, but she did a lot over the years, marriage counseling, is that they're both they both are struggling because they grew up and have unhealthy baggage from their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still interrupting their marriage. They're still carrying that baggage into their marriage, and it makes it really unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, and this is an issue that I work with a lot with people, and it's so true. I mean, we have to bring our whole selves into these relationships in order for them to work. But often people come together for the wrong reasons. They come together because they're needy, or they're lacking something and they want it from the other person, and those marriages are going to struggle. I agree
Yep.
with you.
Yep.
So what is life like for you now?
It's very busy, but I've always been busy, so it's just kind of part of me. But I feel very blessed. You know, I'll be 80 a week from Monday, October the 9th.
Wow.
And I still can do 25 or 30 push-ups in the morning when I get up. And I can go outside and work and go upstairs and walk up hills. But I also enjoy writing. I do a blog. Uh, last week I I do a 5 to 7 minute blog every month, video blog, and then write a 700 to 800. This month it's 1,000 words, because I talked about humility this month and how important it is to be humble. But you can't be humble unless you really believe in yourself. See, you got to believe in yourself, and when you help other people believe in themselves, you're actually helping them become more humble too, because then they don't worry about lowering themselves and looking up to you and saying, well, tell me about it.
Wow. Good
So
point.
anyway, I do that every month, and that keeps me a little bit busy, but I enjoy that. I feel blessed to be able to write those kind of things because I know they help people. I've written some books. I was talking to a guy from the Air Force today, and I got a text yesterday from a guy who said, I've been in the commander of the Air Education Training Command in his in his waiting room, and this book was on the table. It was on the chief staff's reading list in 2012.
Wow. What
And
is
I
that? Tell us about what that book is about.
Leading with Honor, Leadership Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton.
Okay.
A leadership book with 14 chapters. 6 of them are leading yourself and 8 are leading others, but they bring in a story from the POW camp and what our leaders did and what we learned from it. But then I, as a leadership coach, I explain how that lesson applies in today's workplace. And then there's coaching at the end of every chapter. Well, this book is still going strong. When I spoke at the Air Force Association conference 2 weeks ago in DC, a bunch of young people came up and said, would you sign my book? And I said, absolutely. I'm so glad you still have it. So anyway, speaking about and sharing lessons of life and leadership, it's just a blessing. I think God put me through that and allowed me to go through it and come out a stronger person that can help others. And I'm still able to do that. Speaking and doing, I was on the phone this morning, on a Zoom this morning. I'm doing a 3-hour leadership workshop with some military group of leaders in Washington, D.C. Later this month.
How do you feel about the way our military is being run right now?
I think it's really difficult right now in our culture today for a lot of reasons. There's some things that are being thrown in that are probably overstated that they're having to deal with, but also the young people are being recruited right now because there's such a shortage of workers. A lot of companies are giving them an added bonus to come work for us, and there's a high recruitment because they need people so badly. So that's competing. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of young people just have not experienced a lot of responsibility. They don't see the value maybe in the military. And so I told some folks recently I said, help them understand how this is going to take them from what they didn't get growing up, maybe, to in 4 or 5 years, they're going to be a much more responsible accountability person that's going to help them the rest of their life and their career. Plus, they're going to be with a fun team. If you're a young person today, you're on this all the time, and you're not around people, your peers enough. Military is going to put you with your peers. You're going to be part of a team. It's going to be healthier.
I have a female client who's a flight commander for the Air Force, and she's actually a nurse, so she's gone that route, and she works in the hospital.
Yeah.
as a nurse. Actually, she's moved up, so she's now commander. But yeah, but I hear a lot about things from her, and so wow, I'm so glad I got to talk to you today. This is so fascinating, and you're such an inspiration, Lee. Uh, and I'm someone who has taken problems, a lot of problems and heartache, and turned it into a way to help other people. And I believe that that's really what the lesson is here, that we go through these things because it endows us with that capability to help other people. And you're doing the right thing. But this book is beautiful on so many different levels. It's the story is truly amazing, but the stories within are just so touching. So for anybody that is interested in this topic, and how could you not be? Captured by Love by Lee Ellis. Lee, it's been wonderful. Do you have anything else you want to share before we finish?
Just a couple of things. One is guys don't normally buy romance books, okay? But I promise you, the guys who have read it, they told me I have tears on one page and I'm laughing my head off the next page in the
Oh,
book, because it goes from being serious and a little painful of what they went through, the wives and husbands, but then it's just funny. There are a lot of funny stories in there, because humor was a big part of the POW survival, and it's a big part of a good marriage. You got to have humor in a good marriage. The other thing I was thinking about, I wanted to say was, and you just kind of mentioned this, is that we at a reunion about 8 years ago, there was a table. When our reunions, we have a bar at one end of each end of the table and some food in the middle, and we just sit around and talk, and our wives get together and talk. But we're sitting there, and about 7 of us there, all POWs, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and one force, the only 4-star general that of our group that made 4 stars was sitting there, and I'd roomed for him for a couple of years. And one guy said, guys, I would never volunteer to be a POW, but I wouldn't change a thing.
oh wow.
And everybody agreed. We were better men because of our suffering. We were sad that our families had to suffer, but we couldn't change that. But we knew that we were better men because of our suffering, and the way what the wives did to change our treatment was a huge part of that. And the last thing I want to say is, there's so many, between every chapter in that book, there's a 1-page historical highlight, and half of them are from the POW camp, war stories from the POW camp, and half of them are what the wives and families were doing back home, and their courage, and they're the real heroes.
Mm.
So I think you'll enjoy the history there of learning what was happening from 1965 to 1973.
Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of history in the book. So it's you've done such a beautiful job of writing this. Oh, Greg Godek is the love expert that helped you
Yeah.
write the book. Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
he
It's
did.
his
He did.
Lee Ellis, former POW, Greg Godek, love expert. Okay. Well, that's great. And that's how you were able to come together with this beautiful book. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today. It's just been so rewarding. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you for what you do to help others too. God bless you.
Thank you. Take care.